Welcome to part 1 of using grain within Reason 10. Now, what is grain? Grain can be considered both a sampler and granular synthesizer. And grain does not actually use oscillators to create its sound, but rather audio samples. We do have one basic oscillator here that is available to us if we'd like to enhance the audio sample that we're using. Say, for instance, if adding lower frequency to an audio sample that may not have much low-end content to begin with. Now there are a number of presets to choose from, and we can see the different types in the browser here. So if I go ahead and click on the patch browse or browse patch area here, we're taken to chords and textures. By default, we can actually click the up arrow to move one folder up, and we can see that we have bass, chords and textures, effects, melody, and so on. A lot of different varieties that we can choose from as far as the presets are concerned. We can also load our own audio samples into Grain, and you should be safe with WAV and AIF files, though I actually have loaded MP3 files in here as well, and they seem to work just fine. So now let's take a look at the main sections of Grain. We'll start from the top, and we've got our patch selection area for browsing, loading, and saving our patches. We then have a sample section where we can drag audio files that we'd like to use, and we have a visual display of the waveform of our imported file. Of course, we'll go into this more in depth in a moment. We then have an area for choosing the particular algorithm that we'd like to use to manipulate our audio file. And this is really the foundation of where we can choose the sonic behavior of our patches, you could say, or our audio samples. And it is basically the sound engine of Grain. We have an area for adjusting our pitch and tuning. The one oscillator that I mentioned earlier. We have a filter section here, an amp section to the right. To the far left here, we have a global performance and play controls. We then have an envelope section in the center, an LFO, a modulation bus at the bottom, and lastly, we have an effects section. And we're going to cover each of these in detail in part 1. In today's tutorial, though, we are going to focus our attention on the top header here and the sample area. And these may not seem like the most exciting areas to cover, but there's a lot to know here, and this will serve you as the foundation for all of our future videos. So I definitely would recommend sticking around to check this out. There's actually going to be more than you may anticipate being to learn about these couple of areas. So let's start from the very top then. And first we have a MIDI node on LED that will illuminate when Grain is receiving MIDI input. And I mention this because it's a helpful tool to use if you're trying to troubleshoot not getting any audio from Grain. This will be the first place to look at to see if MIDI is actually being received by Grain. We then have our patch display area, and we can actually click in this display and choose from the patches for the particular folder that we are working in. So if I were to come to, say, the pads folder and select the additive evolution, we can see that that's now loaded into the display. If I click there, we can see the other patches that are within this folder there. We can also use these up and down arrows to navigate within the patch folder. My preference is actually to, if we be sure that we've got this blue border around the patches, use the up and down arrows on your QWERTY keyboard to navigate between the different patches. We also have an icon for saving a patch. If we've made any adjustments to the parameters, we can then choose a location in our Explorer or Finder window and save that there. We can then rename this particular Grain instance to be whatever we'd like. We also have an area for voices, and we have a maximum of 12 voices. We're controlling the polyphony here, or how many voices that can be played back at the same time. So we can have a maximum of 12 within Grain, and we can just click, hold, and drag in this field to set those. We can also use these up and down arrows to set that. We then have a master stereo volume control here. Now we'll move on to the sample section, and in the upper left-hand corner here, we have our sample name. And when we choose patches up above here, these only contain a reference to the audio sample being used along with the parameter settings throughout Grain for that particular patch. So this is going to be the actual name of the audio file that is being used in our patch as the foundation for our sound. We could actually use the up-down arrows here to choose a different audio file as our base while still keeping the different parameter settings that come along with this particular patch. So if I go ahead and click the down arrow, just notice that the parameters here are going to remain the same, even though our wave file or our audio file and waveform display do change. So this can open up creative possibilities if you kind of like the parameter settings or want to just experiment and see what a different audio sample will do with the Astral project or whatever patch you're using. With those settings, go ahead and use the up and down arrow there to change your audio file. Now if we click the folder icon there, we can see that our browse highlight then switches focus here, and we can then come to the browser and navigate our system to load any audio file that we'd like to experiment with within Grain. And of course, using AIF, WAV, and MP3s apparently working here as well. Now, I'm not sure if there are any limitations as far as the length of the audio files is concerned, but I have loaded some pretty long samples in here. Just keep in mind that at a certain point, they're going to be a little bit difficult to manage within the displays here. But we do have this edit sample button that we can always make use of. So if I click that, then we open up our sample editor, and then we can come in and adjust the start and end markers. I'm just going to make this really short and then save that. And then our sample is going to be much smaller. Within the displays that we're working with. So that's just one way that you can really hone in on the specific area of a longer audio file that you would like to use. And you don't have to worry about your original audio file being cropped or shortened, because Reason is going to make a copy of that file and then save it within your song. Now we can also drag in audio files from our browser. I have a folder of my field samples here, so I'll double click. I'll come to instruments, and so I can just click and drag that over and load like that. We can also drag from an Explorer window or a Finder window on the Mac. We can even drag files from our desktop. And lastly, which I think is actually the coolest thing, is that we can actually record an audio sample directly into Grain from a mic that we may have connected and set up within Reason. So the possibilities are pretty endless, with this feature. So we've got that start sampling here. So if we click that, then we have this window that pops up and we can see our audio that we're recording. Right now, my mic is being used by my screen capture software, but we can see how that works. We could just stop or go into edit when we're done to edit what we've recorded. I'll just go ahead and stop. And this is going to show up blank again because my mic is not set up properly. I'm going to drag that sample back in. Also keep in mind that if you bring in a stereo audio file, it may look like it's in mono, but that's just going to be the display. Don't worry that your files are being converted from stereo to mono. They are not. That's just how the display is. It's going to show a mono waveform. Now we saw a moment ago that we can use the edit sample button to crop any long audio files, but we also have a couple other areas where we can manage the portion of audio that we'd like to use within our patch. And we can always see our entire sample up in this sample overview window up above. And we can then use the orange brackets to determine the specific area of our song sample, of our audio sample that we'd like to manipulate. So as I adjust the brackets, you'll see that the sample display area here adjusts along with that. So I'll come to the left bracket and drag that in, and we can see our display, our waveform display updating. I can come to the right bracket and then drag that, and we're just really moving in on the specific area of our audio file that we would like to play back and manipulate. We can even just come to the center of those brackets and drag left or right to choose different portions of that audio file. Now, according to the manual, these brackets can be automated, but I haven't gotten to the section or seen where that can be done. But throughout this series, once I discover how to do that, we'll go ahead and talk about that along with some other automation tips within Grain. And lastly, up above here, we have a playback button where we can audition our audio sample and hear it back as it originally is without any of the processing that we've done within Grain. So we would just click and hold, and we can hear our original audio file. Now next we have our waveform display here, and this is where we can further determine the area of our audio sample that will play back, as well as the manner in which it will play back. So we have a green sample start marker here, which we can drag to set our sample play beginning. And then we have a red end marker here, which we can set for the ending of our playback. Now notice that the green sample start marker has an arrow or flag pointing to the right here, and this is going to indicate the direction in which our audio playback will move. So from the beginning here to the right. But also keep in mind that we can actually, if I pull that forward a little bit and then move the end marker to the other side of this, notice that that direction changes. So simply by changing the position of these markers, we can change the direction of playback of our audio sample, moving then from the right to the left. And it's also possible to automate the start and end marker positions as well. And we'll take a look at that in later in this series. Now moving on, we have motion here. And with the motion, we have a drop-down menu where we can choose from 6 different modes of playback for our audio sample and its selected range. And keep in mind that these different modes will behave, or how they're going to behave is going to be affected by the particular algorithm that we've chosen here in our sound engine. And we'll go into more depth on that in part 2. But for simplicity's sake, we'll use the long grains algorithm. And I actually also want to reset this device. So I'm going to right click and just reset and reload our audio sample in there. And we've got long grains, which is what I want. And let's move on to taking a look at the first mode that we have available. We'll start from the top, and we have freeze. And notice that our markers have changed a bit here. First of all, our end marker is gone, and our start marker, the flag, has been replaced by this pause symbol. So in this mode, we can position our marker anywhere within our waveform that we have, and it's going to play at that static location. So if I go ahead and trigger this with my MIDI keyboard, and while we're on freeze, we're going to jump ahead just a little bit here and take a look at the jitter parameter. Because if we do turn the jitter up, we introduce a bit of random back and forth motion to our playback, or kind of a random modulation. So I'll go ahead and trigger this again and adjust this jitter. And we can see how that's affecting playback. And I'll go ahead and take this back down to 0%. Just keep in mind that if you have tape selected as your algorithm down below here, there will be no sound when you're using freeze mode. Moving on, we have one shot. And this is pretty straightforward, as it will play back our sample from the start marker to the end marker. And we can see that we've got our flag back again here. I'll come to the beginning of our audio file, and our end marker is here. Actually, I'm going to extend out the portion of audio that we're working with to include the complete sample. And so if I press and release a key on my MIDI controller, we can see how that behaves. It's starting from the beginning and moving to the end. Now it's not completing full playback because particularly with this one shot, and with all of these really, or most of them, our amp section is going to have an influence on how this playback behaves. So our release is turned down pretty far, 40 milliseconds to be exact. So if I were to raise this up and then press a key and release, then we can see that that's playing back our full sample in one shot. And if it sounds a little bit strange, it's just because of the particular algorithm that we're using. If I were to change this to tape, we can see that that functions more like a traditional sampler. But I'm going to go ahead and change that back to long grains. Moving on, we then have forward loop. And if you notice, our end marker now has two double arrows. So in this mode, it's basically going to play from our start marker to the end marker and then jump to the start marker again and play back for as long as we have our key held down. Even when we release our key, it's going to continue that cycle if we have our release turned up. Now for this example, I'm going to move our end marker in a little bit there. So we can see I've released my key and it's still going because we have our release turned up a bit there. Now I'm going to take this all the way down and just press and hold. Now when I release, it stops immediately because our release is all the way down. Next in line, we have forward and backward loop, and I'm sure you can guess what's going to happen here. And if you even take notice, our end marker has changed again to have a forward arrow and then a back arrow. So if I press a key on my MIDI keyboard, we're going to start from our start marker, play to the end marker, and then play from the end marker back, and keep cycling back and forth until I release the key. And even after releasing the key, as we've seen, if the release is up, it's going to continue for that release time that is set here. So I'll press and hold a key. If I introduce some jitter, we can even adjust this in real time. Okay, I've released the key and now it's just finishing up that release time of, what are we at now? 2.5 seconds. And moving on, we have end freeze here. And notice that our end marker now has a pause symbol. So as you can imagine, this is going to function similar to the freeze up above where we had our start marker with the pause and we just remained at that static location. So with end freeze, we're going to start from our start marker, play through, and then pause at our end marker. Okay, and that is end freeze. And actually, we can use the jitter here as well. So if I turn this up, we can see we get that modulation there. Take it down. Now our last mode is envelope 1, or envelope. And in this mode, our playback is going to be determined by the curve set in our envelope. We can see motion here, and this is how these two are tied in together. So whatever curve that we're working with here that we've set up, that's going to determine the playback of our audio sample. And we're going to take a closer look at this mode a little bit later in our series. Now moving on, we have speed, and I'm going to go ahead and move this start marker back towards the beginning and change this mode back to one shot, move the end marker out, and now if I play back, we can see that this is pretty much in line with our original sample there and how it sounds. But if we take the speed down at 100%, we get that kind of original playback. As we take it down, we can even freeze it if we come all the way to 0%, so that almost behaves like the freeze mode. And if we move this up past 100, then we speed up the playback. I'll put that back to 100%. Now we've seen what jitter can do. When it's set all the way to the left, we have no effect and our sample is going to play back unaffected. And as we move to the right, we introduce random modulation, which can add more depth to our audio sample. And we've already seen what that can do in a few instances, so I won't go further into that now. And we'll just move on to global position. Now, if we engage global position, then whenever we press a key on our MIDI keyboard, it will begin the new voices at whatever position the sample happens to be playing back at. So the best way to understand this is to just look at it. So I'm going to shorten this playback. Actually, I want to have that longer. So we can see every time I press a key, we're starting back at the start marker. If I change this to global position or activate global position now, actually I'm going to slow down the speed of this. So you can see when I'm triggering the notes by the lead here or by the meter over here, and it's not pushing that position back to the start marker each time I trigger. It's just introducing those new voices at the current position. Now if I go ahead and deactivate, so we can see how that behaves there. And now for the last part of our part 1 in this series, we'll take a look at the root key section here. And when we load samples into Grain, they are analyzed, and Grain attempts to determine its original pitch at the sample start position. So that's important to note. It's not analyzing the whole file and trying to figure that out. It's analyzing what we have at the start position. So we can see that in this analyzed fields, we have A3. The first field is going to be in semitone. The next field is going to be in sense. So if I were to move the start marker forward, we can see that it's reanalyzed, and now it's showing E1 and plus 3 cents. Now I'm going to go ahead and move this back to the beginning of our audio sample. And if we would like to use the analyzed pitch, we can always just click the set. And then you can see that these fields have then updated to what we have here, what Grain found as the pitch for where our marker is set at. And so this is going to place that analyzed root key on the proper note in the keyboard range. And you also do have the option to set this yourself manually. So if you click, hold, and drag on either of these fields, you can click, hold, and drag up or down to set those yourself. And just remember that the first one we have in semitones and the second is going to be in cents. And so with that, we'll wrap up part 1 here. And just know that this wasn't meant to be a sound design tutorial. We're just talking about the parameters and how they function and how they can use them, for you to learn how these function to create the sounds that you have in your head and how they can be used. But if you'd like to get an idea of how Grain can be used creatively in a more musical sense, you can check out the link above here. This is actually a track that I did using Grain to manipulate some vocals to create a more musical effect. And this will give you a better idea if you're interested in seeing Grain in a more musical situation. But as we progress, we'll cover more of sound design and take a look at that in future videos. But until then, thanks for watching. Take care.